I never thought I'd find myself in such a delicate situation, to put it mildly, and yet here I am, sitting in our living room next to my husband Greg, with 3 guys sitting across from us. Guys he had invited himself. My heart was pounding, and a wave of confusion and fear washed over me. Greg, on the other hand, was calm, too calm. He had planned it all, and I only realized when it was too late to do anything about it. The boys, barely in their 20s, stood awkwardly by the door, clearly unsure why they had been dragged here, though curiosity was evident in their eyes. Greg had always been the adventurous type. Pushing boundaries was his thing. But this was too much. "Just trust me," he whispered that morning when I expressed my doubts about his latest brilliant idea. "It'll be fine. You'll see. We'll just relax. Nothing serious, I promise." But now, standing here in my simple dress, feeling the weight of his words, the situation didn't feel light at all. Greg took a deep breath and smiled reassuringly, but it didn't help. The lump in my throat wouldn't go away. "Boys, this is my wife Claire," he introduced me as if we were having guests over for dinner. "Claire, this is Jake, Eric and Matt." I nodded politely, though my voice trembled slightly as I greeted them. Their youthful energy filled the room, and although they were polite, their presence made me uneasy. Greg kept insisting that this was just an experiment, a fun little game, but I wasn't sure what his real intentions were. "We're all just here to relax," Greg said, clapping his hands. "No pressure, no expectations." He looked at me, silently urging me to go along with whatever came next. My mouth went dry, but I trusted him, or at least I wanted to. Jake, Eric and Matt exchanged nervous glances, clearly not understanding what was going on either. I began to wonder, what had Greg told them? Did they know that this was all his idea? Did they think I'd willingly go along with this strange fantasy of his? Greg poured drinks for everyone and handed me a glass. His fingers brushed against mine, which should have been reassuring, but I saw the excitement in his eyes and it scared me. This wasn't about me, I realized. It was about him, about his strange need to prove something, to push the boundaries of our relationship. The boys sat down and Greg gestured for me to join them on the couch. I hesitated, but finally sat down on the edge. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. They started with small talk, asking me about my life, my interests, my marriage to Greg. I answered as politely as I could, but the tension in the air was heavy. Every look, every word felt loaded with unspoken meaning. When Greg leaned back on the couch with a satisfied smile, I realized this was only the beginning. Time passed, and the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Even though no one said anything directly, I felt this unspoken pressure to play along with whatever Greg had planned. Jake, Eric and Matt tried to draw me into the conversation, but I could see them looking nervously at Greg, waiting for some kind of signal. Greg sat in his chair, sipping his drink, looking completely at ease. "Why don't we go outside?" he suggested, nodding towards the patio doors. "It's a nice night, and I think we could all use some fresh air." My heart sank. I didn't want to go outside, where the dim light and seclusion would make the atmosphere even more intimate. But I felt trapped, as if there was an unspoken expectation that I follow. I glanced at Greg, hoping he'd sense my unease, but he didn't seem to notice. He was already getting up. The boys followed him out onto the terrace and I followed, feeling like I had no choice. The cool night air touched my skin as we stepped outside. The stars twinkled in the sky, a stark contrast to the heavy feeling in my chest. Greg motioned for everyone to sit around the fire, and I reluctantly sat down, trying not to look at anyone. The fire crackled merrily. Greg began to talk about the importance of trust in relationships. "Trust is everything," he said, looking at me. "And sometimes, to really trust someone, you have to step out of your comfort zone, push the boundaries a little bit." His words hung in the air, and I realized he wasn't just talking about the two of us. The boys seemed to pick up on it too. Jake, who had been the quietest so far, cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. So what exactly did you have in mind for tonight, Greg? He asked carefully, lowering his voice. Greg smiled, still looking at me. I think Claire needs to loosen up a bit, he said casually, as if stating an obvious fact. She's always been a bit reserved, a bit shy, and I thought tonight would be a good opportunity for her to relax, to feel freer. His words made my stomach clench. This wasn't what I had signed up for. I had agreed to something harmless, something playful. But here I was, sitting under the stars with 3 strangers looking at me expectantly. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I could feel Greg's eyes on me, waiting for my answer. Eric shifted nervously in his seat, glancing between Greg and me. I'm not sure we should be pushing her into this, he began, but Greg cut him off. Relax, Greg said, still smiling. It's all just for fun. Claire knows that, don't you, darling? His question hung in the air, and I couldn't find the words to answer it. My mind raced, trying to understand how I had ended up in this situation. Did Greg want me to play out some fantasy with these guys? Was this a test of my loyalty? Or was he just seeing how far he could push me? Jake, Eric, and Matt were clearly uncomfortable now, their initial curiosity fading. They had probably come here expecting a fun evening, thinking Greg had something exciting in store for them. But now they seemed to realize how serious things had become. I took a deep breath and stood up, breaking the tense silence. I think I need a minute, I said, my voice shaking slightly. I turned to the door, hoping Greg wouldn't stop me. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard his voice. Claire, he said softly, but there was something commanding in his tone. You're not going anywhere. I froze, my hand still on the cold metal of the door handle. Greg's words hung heavy in the air. My heart was pounding, and for a moment I wanted to just run, to open the door and escape back into the house, away from the suffocating tension. But I didn't move. I don't know if it was because I was afraid of embarrassing Greg, or because of that silent, pleading look I saw in his eyes when he spoke. Either way, I slowly turned around and forced a smile, trying to hide the storm of emotions raging inside me. The boys exchanged awkward glances, their discomfort obvious, but they remained seated, unsure of what to do. Sit down, Claire, Greg said quietly, his tone changing from commanding to coaxing, as if trying to calm me down. You're overthinking this. I hesitated for another moment, but finally sat back down. My mind was racing. What was Greg up to? I wasn't naive. Greg had always liked to push boundaries, to test me, but this was something completely different. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the patio, adding to the already tense atmosphere. We've been married for 10 years now? Greg said, addressing both of us. I looked at the boys. They were waiting for my answer, but I could see the unease in their faces. They weren't on board either, not with what Greg was suggesting, but they were deferring to him, unsure of what to do. I don't know what you want from me, I whispered, barely audible. I felt small, as if the weight of Greg's expectations were crushing me. I loved him, I always have, but this situation was turning into something I wasn't prepared for. Greg's expression softened a little, but I could still see the determination in his eyes. I just want you to let go, Claire, he said, to stop holding yourself back. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, but you have to trust me. Can you do that? The question felt like a trap. I wanted to trust him, but trust didn't mean blindly following him into a place where I felt vulnerable and exposed. I glanced back at the boys, who were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure how to handle the tension. Jake leaned forward, breaking the silence. We can just talk, no pressure, let's not rush into anything. His voice was calm, but I could tell he was trying to diffuse the situation. Greg smiled, seemingly pleased. Exactly, let's just talk. He leaned back, his eyes still on me, waiting for me to agree. But inside I was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about talking, at least not for Greg. I sat there, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me. The crackling of the fire seemed to reflect the tension in the air, as if the flames themselves reflected the pressure I was under. Greg's words echoed in my head. Just let go. But I couldn't. I wasn't ready for what he was about to turn this evening into, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. It wasn't about me. It never was. Jake, Eric, and Matt exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly sensing my discomfort. They hadn't expected this turn of events, and it seemed they were looking for a way out, just as I was. Jake cleared his throat, trying once again to break the heavy silence. Look, Claire, if you're not comfortable, we can just call it a day. No hard feelings. His words felt like a lifeline, and I wanted so much to grab onto it. But Greg's eyes were fixed on me, his expression calm but insistent, as if he was waiting for me to make a decision that would define our relationship from now on. He had never pushed me like this before, and now I was standing on the edge of something I didn't want to fall into. I think it's a good idea, I finally said, my voice trembling but firm enough. I'm uncomfortable, Greg. I agreed to try something new, but this isn't what I expected. Greg's face hardened for a moment, a flash of disappointment crossing his expression. He took a deep breath, as if trying to control his emotions, then slowly nodded. I understand, he said, but his tone was cold. I just thought you might want to step out of your comfort zone for once. I jumped at his words. He wasn't just disappointed, he was hurt. But I couldn't let him manipulate me. Greg, I've always trusted you, but this isn't right. I can't just pretend to enjoy this because you want me to. The three boys, sensing that the night was coming to an end, slowly stood up. Jake gave me a sympathetic look as he put his glass down on the table. We didn't mean to cause any tension, he said quietly, turning to me. I hope you can work things out. Eric and Matt echoed his sentiment, apologizing for the awkward situation they had inadvertently become a part of. They gathered their things, nodding politely to Greg before heading for the door, clearly eager to leave. As the door closed behind them, the house fell silent. Greg stood by the fire, staring into the flames, his jaw clenched. I looked at him, not knowing what to say. Part of me felt guilty for not going along with his plan, but a stronger part of me knew I had done the right thing. Finally, Greg spoke, his voice calm but full of disappointment. I thought you wanted more, that you wanted excitement. You've been saying for months how bored you were, how tired of the routine. I just wanted to give you something different. I sighed and moved closer to him, keeping a little distance. I do want change, Greg, I said gently, but not like this. This wasn't for us. It was for you. You were testing me, seeing how far I'd go, and that's not the kind of trust I want in our marriage. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes still fixed on the fire. I could see the thoughts running through his mind, disappointment slowly giving way to understanding. He took a deep breath and finally looked at me. Maybe I went too far, he admitted, his voice softer now. I was just trying to shake things up between us, not realizing how much pressure I was putting on you. Relief washed over me as I heard those words. It's okay to want change, Greg, I said gently, but we have to do it together, not like this, not by bringing other people into it. We need to communicate better, find out what we both want without crossing boundaries that make one of us uncomfortable. He nodded, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. You're right, he said quietly. I pushed too hard. I'm sorry, Claire. For the first time that night, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Greg and I still had a lot to talk about, a lot to work out, but at least for now we were back on the same page. I reached out and took his hand, knowing that tonight would change our relationship. But in the end, maybe it would be for the better.